Hi, everyone. Welcome. Bienvenue. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming to today's event. I'm super excited. It's the 61st event of Disrupting Disruptions, the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Tech Speaker and Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Alex Kutrum, and I'm a professor of feminist and social justice studies at McGill and the organizer of this series. The Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technology Speaker Workshop Series seeks to bring together scholars, creators, and people in industry working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. And I'm so excited to welcome you all to today's event. Our next event is an in-person vernissage for an exhibit on LGBTQ student, faculty, and staff activism at McGill that I curated with my research assistant, Jacob Williams, on October 26th. We will also circulate the PowerPoint also for folks who aren't able to attend. There will be food and drink. Please mask at that event. If you are unable to attend the physical exhibit, which will be up till mid-December, you can visit lgbtqactivism@mcgill.com to see the digital exhibit, which will also include resources for researchers and class use. To continue to celebrate Queer History Month, on October 29th, we're also hosting an event with the Archives Gay du Québec, Quebec's Gay Archives, with Michael David Miller and using Wikipedia. That's limited to 12 folks. It's in French and also masked. Our next virtual event is on November 3rd. Shannon Mattern will be speaking about The City is Not a Computer. You can find our full schedule as well as video recordings of our past events at disruptingdisruptions.com. That is the redirect URL, disruptingdisruptions.com. The other URL is way too long to remember. You can also find our list of sponsors, including Shirk, Milieu, Mila, Ricaf, and more. So for today's event, we have a question and answer option available, the Q&A box below. So throughout the event, you may type your questions in the Q&A box, and there will be some time during the second part of the event for Dr. Chris Gilliard to answer them. We can't guarantee that every question will be answered, but we're grateful to the discussion that you generate. And thank you to our captioner today, Fenella. As we welcome you into our homes or offices through Zoom and you welcome us into yours, let us be mindful of space and place. Past series speakers Suzanne Kite and Jess McLean have pointed to the ways that the physical and material impacts of our Zoom events impact the physical world. They point to the material impacts of the digital world. While the events this semester are primarily virtual, everything that we do is tied to the land and the space that we are on. We must always be mindful of the lands that the servers enabling our virtual events are on. Furthermore, as the series seeks to draw attention to power relations that have been invisibilized, it's important to acknowledge Canada's long colonial history and current political practices. So as many of you know, this series is affiliated with the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at McGill University. McGill is located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Furthermore, the ongoing organizing efforts led by Indigenous communities, such as the Wet'suwet'en people at the Unistoten Camp, water protectors, and people involved in the land back movements, make clear the ever-present and ongoing colonial violence in Canada. Interwoven with this history of colonization is one of enslavement and racism. The university's namesake, James McGill, enslaved Black and Indigenous peoples. It was in part from the money he acquired through these violent acts that McGill University was founded. As past series speaker, Dr. Maxley Blum writes in their book, Pollution is Colonialism, to change colonial land relations and enact other types of land relations requires specificity. I encourage you to learn more about the lands that you are on. Nativeland.ca is a fantastic resource for beginning. So now for today's event, which I'm happy to show the sticker for. Dr. Chris Gilliard, AKA at HyperVisible, is a leading scholar and critic of surveillance technology, digital privacy, and the problematic ways that tech intersects with race and social class. Dr. Chris Gilliard is a writer, professor, and speaker. His scholarship concentrates on digital privacy and the intersections of race, class, and technology. He is the Just Tech Fellow at the Social Science Research Council. He is an advocate for critical and equity-focused approaches to tech and education. His work has been featured in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, EDUCAUSE Review, Fast Company, Vice, and Real Life magazine. Also the piece in the Atlantic that recently came out. He was recently a research fellow with the Technology and Social Change Research Project at Harvard Kennedy School of Shorenstein. I just butchered that name, Shorenstein Center. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Gilliard. Thank you so much for being here, Chris. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the intro. Um, should I start sharing my screen now?
Yeah, please do.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's
I
give
just
it a
stopped my
shot.
video, but go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, here we go.
It's looking good. We can
Is
see
it looking good?
well, we can see our presenter. We can see the present. Now it's
There
perfect.
we
Great.
go.
Awesome. Wonderful.
Okay. So yeah, thank you again for having me. And so I just wanted to give a little, I usually start out with this because I found a lot of people kind of ask me about why I have my camera off or why I have pictures of me in snowboarding gear and things like that. So I usually like to give a little bit of an intro about why I do that, explain that a little bit, and I'll be happy to elaborate later on if there's questions. But um, so yeah, I have kind of a prepared statement on that, so I'll just read it because what has happened is that um, every time I give a talk or do a presentation or anything where there's an appearance, I found that historically people would just snag my image off the web and use it, whatever image they found, and use that to represent me, whether I wanted them to do that or not. And so I wrote up a little thing that, and so the reason I have the flying saucer with the cow is sort of to illustrate, people's data getting hoovered up without their consent. And so I wrote this little thing. And so what I said is that as part of my broad-based rejection of surveillance, whenever possible, I do not put images of myself on the internet. So there are images of me on the internet, but I did not put them there. Also, I typically do not do on-camera events to help destabilize the expectation that people should put their cameras on. I do this because there are many people, whether due to disability, privacy reasons, or technical issues like insufficient bandwidth or computing power, who might prefer to turn their cameras off, but because of power differentials are unable to assert that right. And even here in the States, and there was just, I just finished reading an article about this today. In the States, there was a case in Ohio where a student sued his university because he said that a room scan, he found that a room scan revealed intimate details about his life to his institution and to surveillance company. And so the court ruled that he was correct, and they ruled the room scan of the proctoring company as a violation of the Fourth Amendment. So just thought I'd throw that in there. So I wanted to start with a little bit. I was talking to a friend yesterday about a piece that I wrote in the Atlantic about kind of Amazon surveillance, and also just about the overall surveillance environment that we're living in right now. And my friend told me she has a daughter who is a senior in high school right now. And she told me that she told her daughter that because they didn't know where she might be going to college next fall, she told her daughter that she should not download or use any period tracking apps. And because she's afraid that depending on where she goes to school, that this information that companies often give to either law enforcement or third parties, in some cases the way some laws in the States Act, there are even some uh, how shall I say this, there are even some ways in which um, like other third parties, like there's like a kind of right of private action where other people might pursue an individual who's seeking reproductive health. And so she was really afraid for her daughter based on just like period apps, and like how and how like the laws and surveillance work and things like that. And so I thought kind of two things about that. One, like how horrifying is it that there's this level of invasiveness into people's lives by the technology that we use, and frankly, that is used against us. And two, talking about, because a good chunk of this talk is about ed tech and ed tech surveillance. How does this shape how we think about education technology and ed tech? And because as much as ed tech is a Chromebook or Google Docs or a learning management system, this also highlights the degree to which education technology, as it's currently composed, is impossible to separate from widespread surveillance, extraction, and data collection. And, and so often people kind of ask like for a working definition of ed tech, which I'm not like I resist often. But I think one of the ways we can think about it is technology that is employed or deployed by educational institutions. And so that covers a wide variety of things. And so as set up for this talk, I asked Dr. Ketchum if she would rather I talk about kind of where the field is or what I'm interested in terms of a lot of this stuff. And I was informed it was up to me, so I decided to do a little hybrid, a little bit of both. For people who don't know me, I think one of the things I might be known for, one of the things I kind of concentrate my scholarship in or research in, is kind of just keeping track of some of the most egregious, some of the worst, some of the most absurd or extractive examples of privacy invasions, of surveillance, of extraction of people's data and things like that. So I thought I'd take people through just a couple of examples that I think illustrate where we are now. And I'm going to go through about 4 or 5 really briefly. Again, I'll be happy to elaborate on any of them. But what I want to highlight is that in each of these, I encourage people to not think of these as a one-off, right? So these are stories that have appeared in national and international publications, a lot of times about students who have been courageous enough or frustrated enough, to come forward about these things. But these are the instances that we know of. And it's not, but these are in no way isolated. And rest assured, for every 1 or 2 that we hear about, there's dozens. And I mean, I would probably assert hundreds of instances that we haven't heard about. So the first one is, so ExamSoft is a remote proctoring system that uses they use face detection, I think, and I want to be careful when I say that because a lot of these companies are very keen on making a distinction between face detection and facial recognition. But there've been, with proctoring companies, and this is just again one example, there've been a number of examples where these systems are not able to recognize or are very poor at detecting the faces of Black folks. And so oftentimes students, and in this case, but in a lot of other instances I could highlight, students have been forced for the duration of their exams to shine bright lights in their face or to move all about their house trying to find the proper lighting so that their faces can get recognized by the system, only just so they can take a test, right? And so I always like to point out, like to register, like how damaging that is, that people are seeking learning, right? Or some aspect of learning. I mean, there's might be a question as to how much like these kinds of tests actually prove learning. But that part of what they have to do is prove to some kind of computational system that they're human, right? Just in order to take a test. And, I can't stress enough like how dehumanizing and demeaning that is. There's another one from recently, this was in Slate. Remote learning accidentally introduced a new danger for LGBTQ students. Now, I mean, again, be happy to talk more about this later. I don't know that I would use the word accidentally. But what happens with a lot of these systems is that there's often a lot of involuntary disclosure involved when students use these systems. And that can be the case for proctoring systems, room scans, things like that I mentioned before, but also systems that monitor students' social media, monitor students' messages to each other and things like that. Because a lot of times, and again, has changed as the climate has shifted more drastically in the last several years. A lot of these times, these systems have like heat lists or blacklists and white lists of terms. And because of the ways that, I mean, frankly, that sexuality is being criminalized, often like terms that would be used by a student, you know, like queer or gay or trans, these terms are flagged and sent often to teachers, sometimes to police or school resource officers, sometimes to parents. And so a lot of times children or young people are yeah, there's a lot of involuntary disclosure where these folks are involved. This was another story that came out in a Dallas paper about a system that supposedly, again, is supposed to be used in order to create a climate of safety on college campuses and in K through 12, right? And so part of what the system does is it monitors the social media accounts of students. But what the expose found out is that it wasn't being used for things like, or, I mean, so in addition to its purported use for things like, you know, safety and potential school shooters and things like that, the campus police were using it to keep track of students and student protests. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But again, like this isn't a one-off thing. Like this is the trajectory that always occurs when surveillance systems are placed in our institutions. There was a recent, really excellent long-form study done by the Center for Democracy and Technology that talked about the harms of student surveillance, right? And so I just want to go through these bullet points really quickly. Again, I'm a little bit running through some of this kind of quickly, and part of that is because I'm hoping to have more time for discussion at the end, but I'll be happy to elaborate on any of these things. So they pointed out approximately half of students are not comfortable expressing their true thoughts and feelings online when they know they are being monitored. This proportion jumps to more than 6 in 10 among students with learning difference or physical disability. And when you think about, and this was about K through 12, this is about K through 12 schools. And when you think about the extent to which that kind of era in young people's lives is so formative, it's so much about growth and exploration, and that in order to have these things, you have to have safety. But what these systems do is kind of in the name of safety, they rob a lot of students of safety. And I'm going to elaborate on that in a second, but I'll go through these other points. 44% of the teachers report that student activity monitoring has led to students being contacted by law enforcement, likely in part because 37% of teachers at schools that use student activity monitoring outside of school hours report that law enforcement directly receives alerts that are flagged after hours. And these could be for a whole variety of things. You know, schools get to set the terms that kind of flag students. And 13% of students report that they or someone they know has experienced non-consensual disclosure of their sexual orientation and or gender identity. And as a result of student activity monitoring, LGBTQ plus students feel the effects of student activity monitoring, including but not limited to being outed more than their peers. as seen by the number of students reporting that this has happened to them or someone they know. And one other thing I would add to this, this is not on this bullet point or this slide from CDT, but a lot of this stuff, I mean, so the slide points to this in regards to LGBTQ plus students, but so much of surveillance has a disparate impact on not only that segment of students, but also students of other kind of marginalized groups or particularly Black and Brown students. And I think there was something like, yeah, I don't have the stat in front of me, so I don't want to name it, but a large percentage of these kind of interventions were aimed at Black and Brown students. And here, the last one, and this also is kind of on this monitoring software. Todd Feathers just did a really great piece a few months ago in the markup about this. And he directly asked some of these companies if they were adding terms about reproductive health onto their kind of list of flag terms. Now, I want to be very careful when I say what I'm about to say, because some of these companies are very litigious. For the most part, the companies denied that they would do this. But I don't have a lot of faith that their denial will be consistent and maintained when they are pressured by local government and parents. And so that is kind of like where we are. And I mean, I unfortunately could provide examples of this all day. That's sort of like kind of where we are in the field right now. And so just to one other point on this. So I really want to reinforce the carceral nature of these technologies. And so it might seem, or like kind of a common refrain, is that the ways in which these systems are used to police students is incidental, or it's like a sort of a negative externality. But what I would argue is that they're actually like baked into these systems, that there's no way to have these systems without these things. And again, I want to be careful because there might seem to be kind of an air of like tech determinism when I say this. But a way I like to think about it is that when we look at surveillance technologies, extractive and privacy invasive technologies, they're best understood as mechanisms for control. So, and that is the ideology that drives the development and deployment of these systems. So an example I give is that one of the, a CEO of one of the proctoring companies said something to the extent of, when talking about his system, well, we are the cops. Actually, I mean, that part's a direct quote. He says, we are the cops. And I found that really illuminating because I don't think he misspoke, right? I think he was speaking like very clearly and articulating the carceral nature of these systems. And I think that, I mean, in some other articles and things I've written, I've kind of argued that, or used the phrase that surveillance always finds its level. And what I mean by that is that ultimately these systems, because they're mechanisms for control, are always going to fall kind of first, heaviest, and most often on the most vulnerable and marginalized. And that's not an accident. I think that's very much by design. And so I want to talk a little bit about how I came to start working on this stuff and looking at it, and kind of what I'm working on and thinking about now. And this part I'm really going to blow through, but again, like happy to go into it more if anyone is interested. And so kind of what set me on this path is I teach at in the States at a community college, a two-year college. And the administration at my system decided that they were going to start filtering the internet at a college. And so what this resulted in, so I'll give a specific example. At the time, and this was several years ago, but my students were doing work on what at the time was referred to as revenge porn, but now it is more kind of aptly named as non-consensual intimate imagery. And my students kept coming up to me and saying, hey, there's no scholarship on this. There's nothing written about this. And I knew that there was, but then what I found out is that the filters on campus were preventing them from getting anything if they did a search, because the search kind of acted as if they were looking for porn, not for a scholarship on revenge porn. And so that sort of set me down the road. Some colleagues and I set us down the road of pushing very hard against the administration in order to kind of get them to reverse this policy. And I started to think about and develop some ideas, some ways to kind of think about how, like what this meant for students, because it very, and so I should add too, that this wasn't just, it wasn't just students who couldn't do their work. Like I was also, like everyone on campus was filtered. You know, I couldn't even watch a YouTube red band trailer if I wanted to. So I started to think about what that meant for people who already maybe in many cases didn't have great internet access, people for whom, you know, were only could do their work when they were on campus, you know, all kinds of different ways that sort of prevented people from like literally accessing knowledge. And so I came to term that digital redlining, which I call the creation of tech policies, practices, pedagogy, and investment decisions that enforce class boundaries and discriminate against marginalized groups. So this used to be the page that would come up that students would see. In this case, the person was actually trying to access an interview, I think, of Jimmy Carter that was in Playboy. Now, I mean, you could make an argument, I guess, that students shouldn't be able to look at Playboy on campus. I mean, I wouldn't make that argument, but in this case, they were actually trying to look at the articles, and this was what would come up. And there was a way in which it was also extra sort of harmful, because it didn't tell the student or anyone why they weren't getting what they were getting. It just says, you can't have this. And that is kind of like what set me on the road to sort of thinking and talking about some of this stuff. So I think there's a couple things that drive these kinds of policies and these technologies. I think one of the really prevalent ones is safety. And so we talked about that a little bit. You know, whether that's the claim that it's saving kids from school shooters, or it's preventing people from viewing objectionable material, things like that, right? Preventing cheating. And so I think that's one drive. And what I always stress is there is very little to no independent empirical evidence that these systems do the things that the companies say they do. So the companies will cite their own research, but there is often little, and I mean, I hesitate to say none, but it's pretty close to none. No evidence that these things do the things that are supposed to, that they claim they do to make people safe, and in a lot of ways often make some students less safe. You know, the reason the people at my school, the administrators at my school, argued for filtering the internet was to keep students safe, even though it made my work and the students' work in some cases impossible. But there's two other things that I want to mention that I think are really important about like what drives institutions to behave this way. And I'm just going to briefly touch on each of them. There's a couple of scholars like I really like and admire who work on this stuff a lot. And I'm just going to talk about this briefly. One is Ben Williamson, and he, if you are at all interested in kind of the ways that investment drives the development of educational technologies and what that has to do with surveillance, Ben is the person that you should pay attention to. So he says, according to Holland IQ, a company that tracks and forecasts the edtech market, global spending on edtech will reach 404 billion by 2025, with venture capital investing at pace to seize the opportunity for future financial returns. It also identified that more than 30 private edtech companies have become unicorns with a value of more than $1 billion US, most of them reaching this financial status after investment in 2021. He goes on. Investors are, of course, motivated by return on investment, but ROI is always in the future. So investments must be calculated on the basis of a kind of bet that a certain future will unfold. In negotiations over investment, investors and edtech entrepreneurs engage in the construction of what the economic sociologist Becker calls fictional expectations. Imagine futures that justify economic action in the present and that investments are intended to realize. And so what we get into here is the ways that imagining and predicting when it comes to companies are the same. So what Williamson says that investments are calculated on the basis of a bet about the future, I think is key when we think about this and we think about these companies. When they imagine us and our institutions, they're placing a bet on our futures, on the futures of students. And that bet is mainly, I mean, and I might even argue only about their increasing their profits, but not increasing, learning or equity or justice or any of those other things. I mean, I think they're really important. But there's also a way that this model kind of works with the idea of using machine learning systems in schools, whether that's about who's going to persist, what grade a student will get, who even is who systems think might be a criminal or school shooter or a cheater, in their desire for certainty, academic institutions of all stripes invest in a variety of prediction tools. The more I think about these systems, I think that there are a lot of embedded and emergent harms. Systems that seek to predict an outcome are fully invested in creating that outcome or maintaining existing conditions. So there's the second scholar that I wanted to mention is Sun-Ha Hong, who says that data-driven predictions work primarily as instruments for systematic extraction of discretionary power, the practical capacity to make everyone's decisions and defines one's situations. This extractive relation reprises long historical pattern in which new methods of producing knowledge generate a redistribution of epistemic power. Who declares what kind of truth about me to account for what kinds of decisions? He goes on. Making human behavior more predictable for the client of prediction, the manager, the corporation, the police officer, the school administrator, I would add, often means making life and work more unpredictable for the target of prediction, the employee, the applicant, the citizen, the student. And so if I have a little bit more time, I'll give like a couple specific examples of this. There's an example out of Pasco County, Florida, where they basically developed a predictive policing algorithm with the idea of that they could predict who was going to be a criminal. They got federal money for this, and they aimed it at young people. They aimed it at students, and they use things like attendance records and grades, and if there had been violence in the home. And part of that process that they used, or part of what they did with this information, was to then harass those students and their families with the intent of getting them to move out of the area. So in a lot of cases, I think it's always important. I mean, even I think sometimes before the theoretical discussions about these systems, is to answer the question of like, do they actually work? And I often find that that this is not a question that institutions ask. But again, often these companies and the claims they make about their tech, they're basically asserting things that are impossible. We can tell the future. We can prevent violent acts. We can tell you who's a criminal or who has, the tendencies to do certain things. But in many cases, they not only don't work, but they make worse many of the conditions that we should be trying to alleviate at institutions. And so there's sort of like a double-edged sword of like evil in that kind of way. So I told Dr. Ketchum I'd only go for 30 minutes. I hope this is enough to kind of generate conversation. If it's not, I'll be happy again, like I said, to go back over some of this stuff. But yeah, that's what I have, and I would love to talk to people about it.
Awesome, Chris. Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. So for folks that are listening, I welcome you to write questions in the Q&A box below. While we're waiting for some of your questions, I'm going to start us off, if that's okay. So thank you again, Dr. Gilliard, so much for this presentation. It was great. And I think many folks are probably hearing this and thinking how dystopian and sci-fi this all sounds. But one of the things that I was hoping you could expand upon, just because you actually nodded towards it during your presentation, was if it's possible for you to kind of expand on this idea of you questioning this framing of things as being accidental. You had that headline of remote learning accidentally introduced a new danger for LGBTQ students, and you kind of hinted that you don't see it as accidental per se. And I'm just wondering if you can kind of speak more to those dynamics.
Yeah. So what I mean, I'm not as keenly attuned to the anti-gay, queer, and trans movements in places outside of the US. Okay. But I can say with absolute certainty that that those things exist here, that they're snowballing in, I think, some really scary and dangerous ways, building on a history, so it's never gone, but it seems to be getting worse, not better. I don't believe that these technologies exist in a vacuum. I think, again, first and foremost, that most all surveillance technologies are instances, like ideologically, they're they're invested in control. And so I'm skipping around a little bit, and so I'll be like extra blunt about this. In a society that is anti-Black, anti-gay, anti-trans, these systems exist to forward the purposes of that society. And so when it comes out that these things are doing are being leveraged in certain ways, it's certainly not an accident.
Thank you so much for that. And we've now started to get some audience questions. So I'll start with the first one. An anonymous attendee writes, and I understand that like maybe part of this you can't speak to because some of these companies are so litigious, but the attendee writes, are you able to give names for specific school surveillance companies, softwares for further research? And then the person thanks you for the presentation and says it's been so enlightening.
Yeah, I can give you tons of names of them. I will just name some of them, and I am not going to comment on them. Social Sentinel, Gaggle, Proctorio, ProctorU, Examity, ExamSoft. Yeah, those are some of the big ones. There are others, but yeah, those are some of the ones, some of the most popular ones with educational institutions.
Thank you. And Sydney, do you want to read the next question? You're still muted, Sydney. Okay.
Sorry, just finding the button. So yesterday, McGill's faculty, so an anonymous attendee writes, yesterday, McGill's Faculty of Education hosted an event partnered with a group called Mindshare Learning about the state of EdTech in Canada. It featured speakers from Texas Instruments, Paper Learning, the OECD, as well as the Dean of Education and other professors in the department. The event was sold out, so I didn't go, but it was clear from the promotions that it was normalizing, even embracing EdTech. I was hoping to hear Dr. Gilliard's perspective on the role of students and faculty in opposing these kinds of events. How can we resist the way our universities frame EdTech as neutral or positive?
Well, thank you for this question. I love this question because, well, I love it and hate it. And let me explain why. You know, I was on with Paris Marks on a Tech Won't Save Us podcast about a month ago. And Paris asked me for like some sign of optimism. And what I said is that there's been a lot of movement by students themselves to push back against these systems in K through 12, as well as in college and in grad school. Now, the reason I hate this question is because it's partly not because of the author of the question, it's because of my answer. And what I mean by that is I think that it should be more incumbent on adults to create a better world where I'm not pointing to young folks having to lead the way in order to like make better conditions for themselves. I mean, like there's ways that I'm glad that they're able to do that and I want them to have the agency to do that, but I also don't think it should be on them. But that is kind of one ray of sunlight, you know. In terms of how faculty push back, that can be really difficult because a lot of people are in precarious positions. A lot of times administrators make these decisions without faculty input. A lot of times use of these systems is mandated by, you know, the contract of the school. And also institutions spend a ton of money on these systems, absent evidence that they work. But, you know, there's a way in which kind of procurement equals policy, right? So if you spend a bunch of money on something, like you're not going to put it in the corner, right? Even if you're, you know, deep down, you know that it doesn't work. So it's very difficult. I mean, one of the things that I would assert is an easier thing to do is to push for evidence of the efficacy of these systems, because mainly it doesn't exist. And, you know, if you are seeing it, it's almost always coming from the company who's selling it to you, you know? And so for institutions that pride themselves on being data driven, I think it's really important to ask them, where's the data that these systems actually do anything, versus where, you know, the degree to which they pose the illusion that they're actually doing something. And that's one way, even I think people who are not in the best positions to resist these things can kind of push the issue a little bit.
Thank you so much. And I think there will probably be some more follow-up questions related to that in particular. But Cody writes, we've been thinking about how to measure whether this tech has any effect on student safety, particularly self-harm and violence. Are you aware of any research on that, or if it's yet to be done, how it could be structured?
So that's a difficult question because the companies themselves do not release their data. And so they are, I mean, I think you could guess the reasons for that. And so when, you know, I've said this a couple times, and so I want to be super explicit. When I say there's little, what I actually mean is there's none. You know, I typically say little because I don't want, you know, I always want to find some obscure study and be like, ah, you missed this one. But there's not evidence that these things actually make students safer. You know, I referenced the Center for Democracy and Technology study, and that just came out, I think, maybe in July or something like that. The 74 million, which is another education publication, has done a couple of really long form pieces on the ways in which these systems harm students, even particularly students who are, you know, maybe considering self-harm or struggling with mental health in some way or another. Because I think, and one way I would explain this is that there is a real drive to conflate surveillance and safety. You know, Tawana Petty always says surveillance isn't safety. Surveillance ain't safety. And so there's a real drive to conflate these two things. You know, the idea that if we just watch people enough, that we can like keep them safe. Okay. And the problem is that that is actually not what keeps people safe. I mean, we know so many of the things that keep people safe. It's you know, feeling safe and secure. It's being fed. It's having, you know, a lot of your economic, you know, issues like resolved. Like it's having people you can confide in. Like all of these things, right? A lot of times institutions do not want to invest in those things. And so these technological systems are put in place because there's a lack of political and institutional will to do the things that we actually know work. So we're going to consistently see companies saying, we saved this many people, or, you know, it keeps 10%, whatever. Like there's very little outside of what the companies offer themselves to suggest that these things actually do what they say they're going to do. There are, I mean, I'll be happy to if this person wants to send me their email, like I would send them some studies done by a variety of groups and scholars in the last decade that talks about all the ways it doesn't do these things and makes marginalized students and communities much less safe.
Thank you, Sydney. Do you want to read the next one? We can just go back and forth.
Great. Sure. So an anonymous attendee writes, are plagiarism detection services implicated in this? If so, what kind of issues surround these systems?
Yeah, I mean, short answer, yes. Like, I think that the plagiarism detection systems are like one of the biggest boondoggles and most extractive pieces of tech to come out of ed tech, like ever. And so the initial problem with them, and you know, like if there's any like sticklers in the audience, they'll note that students lost this court case. But the initial problem with them is that they operate on stolen property, right? That the way these systems work is that they have leveraged an immense body of student intellectual property to then measure up against all subsequent works that are submitted. And so what I mean by that is, if we take some of these systems, so if I'm a professor and I say, you have to upload your paper to System X in order to pass the class. So whatever I wrote, like then becomes the property of System X, which they then use to make money. So it's like inherently, and like I don't have a choice if I'm a student. I mean, my choices do that or don't do that and fail. Those are my two choices, which like is a form of duress that doesn't actually constitute choice. So even like, so foundationally, they are inherently extractive and exploitive. Like, I can't, so I don't think they should exist. But the other problem is that, that for the most part, what these systems do, so many of the issues that we understand as like plagiarism and cheating and things like that, subversion of assignments, like, now there's ways that people can use, large language models and so-called artificial intelligence to create to write essays and things like that. So many of the problems that we encounter with these things can be much better addressed instead of surveilling students or stealing their intellectual property by like crafting better assignments and engaging students in learning and getting them to do things that they find interesting and useful. Because if you look at the scholarship on plagiarism, like most of the reasons that students do, I mean, it boils down to two main reasons. Neither one of them are like students are trying to like get over. One is that they don't understand what they're being asked to do, or two is that they don't find the value in what they're asked to do. And so if we craft better assignments and have better pedagogy, like we won't have some of these issues in the first place.
Thank you. And I think too, maybe some of the audience might not know in terms of like, since we have some folks from McGill and stuff, even just our own kind of platforms in which our courses are hosted, the things that we can't opt out of, even the kind of surveillance that happens on those same kind of platforms without consent of professors, being able to see everything a student clicks on and how much time they spend looking at assignments and stuff, and how just pervasive all of these technologies are.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go for it. No, go for it. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, and yeah, those things are not proxies. They're not good proxies for learning.
Definitely. Yeah. And even if professors, because this kind of lines up for the next question, even if professors, instructors, TAs aren't choosing to look at it, I have to say I have more going on in my life. I don't really care to see what everyone's doing, right? The fact that this data is being collected without people knowing is a problem, especially when you can't opt out of this. And this kind of leads into the next question from Satya, sorry if I mispronounced your name, who writes, huge fan of your work, Dr. Gilliard. I find that when I raise concerns about surveillance and power differentials with my friends in the corporate world, they say, I have nothing to hide, or my kid has never complained. EdTech is an entrepreneurial triumph, a startup industry dream, or for example, in India where I'm from, and also blatantly predatory. Yet it is hard to have conversations on this subject since I'm viewed as a downer. Would you have any tips on raising and discussing these issues?
So I have a sort of a canned, I mean, well, I think I would ask for a little bit of qualification on who you want to raise the issues with, because that affects my strategy a little bit. But I have sort of a canned absurdist answer when someone says they have nothing to hide, right? I mean, I say, take off all your clothes, give me the keys, give me your keys and give me your passwords to all your devices, okay? Like, and nobody's gonna do that. And so like, but like, because so nobody believes that when they say I have nothing to hide, right? What it is, I mean, so it's kind of at least two things operating at once, right? One is that it comes from a position of outrageous privilege, right? Which is the idea that whatever you're doing, you are not going to be persecuted for it, right? Like, and so many of us, me included, don't live in that world, but the other thing that presupposes, right, the other assumption, like the really faulty assumption that's based on, is the idea that that outside parties have a right to anything that is me, right? That that's not how rights work, right? That's how privacy works. Like, I'm not obliged to share anything with anybody, right? Like the basic way that privacy and rights work is that I only have to provide what I am willing to provide at the moment I'm willing to provide it, and only for the duration during which I want to provide it, right? That's what consent means. And so nobody believes that, right? Like nobody does. It's a way to short circuit conversations when people, I mean, and a third thing I would add is that it's an assertion about a really faulty belief that these systems work and that they're fair. Okay. And again, like we could think about facial recognition or all kinds of algorithms. We can just think about law enforcement. I mean, there's so many ways in which these systems often pursue, persecute, prosecute people in ways that are supremely unfair and often, just wrong. And so like that is like the problem with people saying, nothing to hide, right? The second part, my kid has never complained, is I think, I mean, there's again a couple ways I like to think about that, but like everyone like has some notion of consent, right? Like, so again, like we've been bludgeoned by tech companies for at least the last 20 years with these ideas about sharing and privacy and things like that. What consent really means and what it doesn't, and things like that. That we've been bludgeoned by these ideas from companies who have a strong economic desire in shifting the way people think about that. But if you just think about how people communicate with one another, who they tell certain things, who they choose to share with, who they choose not to share with, what kinds of, how they might alter a conversation or recount a story differently to like one set of people than another, all those things. Like everybody has some working knowledge of like consent and privacy and things like that. And so the idea that we should just kind of cede this to tech companies is like a misinformation campaign, like sponsored by Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and TikTok and Meta, and I mean, and so, but the problem, I mean, I want to touch on this last part where they ask about being a downer, okay? And I think that's important because these issues are not, I mean, I obviously think they're important, but I think it's like, I think they're crucial because it gets down to some really important things about like, are you able to like worship freely? Are you able to move about society kind of relatively unbothered? Do you feel safe in your own home? Do you feel safe expressing certain political views? Do you feel safe, uh, trying to improve your conditions politically or economically and things like that? Like all of these things are altered when we completely remove people's privacy from the equation. And so while it's not necessarily like a pleasant thing, I think it's like a crucial thing. And so again, like, yeah, I'm a downer too. I mean, but like, I think society needs us.
Thank you so much for your answer. I'll move to the next question. So an anonymous attendee asked, international students may express their ideas or political views more naturally in other countries where they study, but how is this fear and self-censorship to be measured when they face a possible consequence, they say consequences back home?
I'm not sure. Would they be able to qualify this a little more because I'm not sure I understand.
Whilst I don't know if that person is still here, but whilst they type out a potential response, I can try and expand on, like, just based off of my understanding of the question. I think the question is like, what is the implication of saying something in a virtual space that can be, because it's kind of hard to qualify, you know, if someone from a certain state is saying things against that state in a virtual space, what's the implication? Like, what is the meaning of that in terms of legal action and possible persecution that can follow from making those types of statements in a space that's kind of undefined?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I think it's really important, and it gets to the root of some of these systems that are so extractive, because what you do, you know, like I've been very careful about what I say on this webinar, right? Because like I, in some senses, lose control of it, and it can be extracted and extrapolated in all kinds of ways. I mean, I have a relatively privileged position, but like that is part of the problem with these systems. I mean, and I mean, I'd even expand it to say it's going to become more of a problem if some of the projections, I mean, I don't believe them, but some of the projections about the metaverse and stuff like that come to fruition, because like everything we do is surveilled and extracted. It's then bought, sold, provided to, you know, authoritarian governments, abusive partners, you know, our jobs, in all kinds of ways that often to the detriment of people who I think should be able to freely express themselves.
I think going off of that, I have another kind of question that is a bit, maybe a bit more meta, not in the metaverse way, but more about your own work. So many of these companies are so litigious, right? And they really go after many of their critics. How have you been able to navigate doing the research that you do and the advocacy and activism that you do?
I mean, I've been really fortunate, but I mean, one of the things I do is I rely really heavily on journalists who have done so much work. You know, and when I think about, you know, I mentioned Todd Feathers, Drew Harwell, you know, Carolyn Haskins, Alfred Eng, like there's so many, you know, Jeffrey Fowler, there's so many people who have done this work where I can just say, oh, look what, you know, look what the reporting has said about these things, right? I mean, in some cases, those journalists have faced litigation. And so I think it's important, that work is essential because it's allowed me to just say like, oh, here's what they say in the New York Times about it. You know, I mean, in terms of like Amazon and things like that, like sometimes things have to go through fact checking when you talk about them, but like, you know, I'm certainly a small fry in like their eyes, so I don't think that that's a concern. But yeah, a lot of the ed tech companies, I think, are waiting for someone to step out of line. I mean, there's been a real chilling effect in the last several years. So yeah, I have to also be like, I've been very fortunate, but also have to be very careful.
Thank you for that. I just want to encourage people, we have around 10 more-ish minutes if people want to continue to ask questions in the Q&A box. Well, also, Sydney, if you have a question too, no pressure on you there. But I can also ask another. But perhaps maybe, Chris, while we're waiting for another question, unless Sydney, you wanted to ask one, there was an area that, oh yeah, you've got one. Okay, go for it.
Yeah, I just have a question on how like you could envision like a mediation of these issues. Like, for example, like just with, you know, like facial recognition and the way that it's like really biased for like, it's very like racist and colorist. How can that be mediated, considering like how powerful like all of these and like interconnected all of these big companies are? Like, is that like a national, international, like legal action type of thing? Like, what would need to be in place for this to be corrected? Because it's just going to keep it, also seems so new and like constantly growing at like an exponential rate. I just don't really understand how we can like get a grip on like these issues and like correct them, if not like dispel them.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll say from the get-go, like when it comes to a lot of these technologies, like I'm an abolitionist, right? Like I think that the way we mediate them is like by like breaking them into little pieces and launching them into the sun. Like I don't think they should exist. And the reason I say that is I think that I mean, Luke Stark, for me famously called facial recognition the plutonium of artificial intelligence, with the assertion being that it's so dangerous and so detrimental to society that we should think about it, a widespread ban of it. So I think something like that, like, and people think that that's an outrageous position. I don't, and I think that there's been a lot of movement in the last few years, and some of this has been rolled back, unfortunately. There's been a lot of movement in the last few years, including some companies, in some cases, pulling back from it a little bit. Where at least the 5 or 6 or 7 years before that, if you said like, I think it should be abolished or it should be banned, people would just kind of try to laugh you out of the room. So I think there's a really difficult tension, because law enforcement is really reluctant to give up tools and powers that they have. Also in the States, there are sometimes some restrictions on law enforcement, but none on private companies. And then law enforcement can go either just kindly ask for it, or in some cases buy the data. And we have very little to no restrictions against those things. I think it's going to be an ongoing fight, but when I look at what are supposed to be the positive use cases for something like facial recognition, versus pretty well explained and consistent examples we have of the ways that it's consistently abused, misused, used to target people unfairly, to harm people, to track and surveil people doing fully legal activities, and then perhaps punish them for that. Hartzog and Selinger talk about obscurity in a society, right? Which, I kind of alluded to this earlier when we were talking about rights. But the idea is that, like, part of the way that a free society is supposed to work is that I'm able to go about my business kind of unbothered by the government, right? Like, so the government, it's not any of their business what my medical conditions are, or who I'm dating, or what my religion is, or any of a whole number of things that are not illegal or, in any way kind of like out of bounds. But that now the way that facial recognition and all kinds of tracking works is it's like stripped us of all of those things. Like, you can't have a functioning free society when you have that. And like, we're pretty far down that road, and I don't think it's ever too late to turn back. But like, part of like turning back is, I think, like widespread banning and abolition of many of these technologies.
Oh, did you want
That's great. Thank you so much for answering the question. I really appreciate it.
So Dr. Gilliard, no one else has typed in any questions in the Q&A box. So I just wanted to ask you if there was anything else that you wanted to end on or add to you, because there were a few places in your presentation you're like, oh, maybe I'll speak about this later. So if there was anything that you felt you wanted to touch on but didn't have the opportunity to.
Yeah, well, how much time do you have? I don't, I feel like the teacher keeping students when they have one foot out the door. But I mean, I just wanted to talk about a little. I had mentioned kind of the predictive policing thing, and I wrote a piece about this for Wired. But it's basically the thing I mentioned in Pasco County, where they developed a predictive policing algorithm for children. And like those words should never exist together in a sentence, except a sentence, there should be no predictive policing algorithm for children. Like, and so the way, I mean, and that I think was kind of the one of the things I was trying to get across is that this is like kind of the most egregious one, but there are several programs similar to this across the country. But that because these are mechanisms for control, like, and in a society that kind of demands certain things of certain populations, that these systems are always going to be used to do this. And so there is, in many ways, like kind of to go back to the last question, in many ways there is no like kind of half measure in trying to make them better or less harmful. Like the only thing to do is to get rid of them. And I mean, like personally, like I think this is true for far more systems than it is for than it is not true.
Thank you. I mean, if there's anything else you want to expand on, where you can. Also, if you're feeling like you want to wrap up, that's also cool too.
No, I'm good unless anyone has any other questions.
Okay, cool. No one's written anything in the Q&A box. So I guess we'll wrap up for the evening. I want to thank you so much for your amazing presentation and for your generous responses to all of the questions. Thank you everyone who's watching live or folks who are watching after. Thank you so much to Fenella for doing the captioning. It's been lovely to have you. Thank you, Sydney, for writing the tech. And I hope folks continue to go to our events. Most of them are virtual or hybrid, and we have recordings of many past events on our website. So thank you all for your support, and this was lovely. So thank you. With recording.